Imagine an empire, not forged by conquest of land, but by the ambition to reshape the world itself. Not with armies of warriors, but with legions of experts, and a treasury dedicated not to plunder, but to progress. In the aftermath of global upheaval, as the dust settled from the 20th century's cataclysms, a new kind of power emerged, the power of aid. Like the vast empires of history that redrew maps and reshaped destinies, this new force aimed to sculpt a different kind of world order. Born from the ashes of World War II, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, rose as a modern-day equivalent of history's great builders. Think of the Silk Road not as a path for spices and silk, but as a conduit for knowledge, technology, and assistance. USAID was envisioned as this artery, pumping American resources and expertise across continents. Its mission? Nothing less than to engineer a world aligned with American ideals, a world reshaped in its image of prosperity and stability. From the grand designs of post-war reconstruction to the intricate challenges of modern global development, USAID has been a colossal undertaking. Consider this. Its reach spans the globe, touching nearly every corner of the developing world. Its budget, in some years, rivals the GDP of entire nations. Like the Mongol Empire's famed horse messenger system that connected vast distances, USAID built a network, a web of programs, partnerships, and personnel designed to influence nations and uplift societies. But unlike empires of old, its tools were not swords and sieges, but strategies of aid and development. Yet, this empire of aid is not without its critics, nor its complexities. Is it a benevolent force for global good, or a subtle instrument of American power? Has it truly lifted nations, or inadvertently deepened dependencies? And as the world order shifts once more, what future awaits this massive engine of international influence? Join us as we delve into the past, confront the present, and speculate on the uncertain future of USAID, an empire of aid in the 21st century. The year is 1947. Europe lies in shattered fragments, a continent decimated by war. From this devastation arose an audacious idea, a plan as ambitious in its own way as any Mongol conquest, the Marshall Plan. Conceived not as an act of charity, but as a strategic imperative, it aimed to rebuild nations, not subjugate them. This was the seed from which USAID would eventually sprout. Imagine the scale. Billions of dollars, a modern-day equivalent of Mongol treasure, poured into reviving economies, not to extract tribute, but to cultivate allies. The Marshall Plan was just the opening act. As the shadow of the Cold War lengthened, the vision broadened. President Truman's Point 4 program emerged, extending the idea of aid beyond Europe. The new frontier was the developing world, Asia, Africa, Latin America. Here, the battleground wasn't just military, but ideological. The mission evolved to win hearts and minds, to offer an alternative to the rising tide of communism. Think of it as strategic diplomacy, but waged with tractors and textbooks, not tanks and tariffs. Technical assistance became the new cavalry charge. In 1961, USAID was formally established, a monumental consolidation of American foreign aid efforts. Under President Kennedy, it was declared a new agency for a new era. The Foreign Assistance Act became its foundational decree, outlining a grand vision of global development. It was to be a civilian army, battling poverty, disease, and ignorance, enemies as formidable as any empire had faced. Like Genghis Khan uniting disparate tribes, USAID sought to unite nations under a banner of progress, with America as the guiding force. Early projects spanned continents, from building schools in Africa to modernizing. The Cold War cast a long shadow. USAID's trajectory became deeply intertwined with geopolitical strategy. Aid became a tool in the global chess game against the Soviet Union. Strategic alliances were forged through development assistance. Massive aid flowed to countries on the front lines of the Cold War, Vietnam, South Korea, and others. It was a complex calculus, humanitarian goals intertwined with strategic imperatives. Like the Mongol Empire adapting its tactics to different terrains, USAID adapted its aid strategies to the shifting fronts of the Cold War, sometimes with remarkable success, sometimes with unintended and controversial outcomes. The Berlin Wall crumbled, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the world order was once again reshaped. With the Cold War's end, USAID's mission recalibrated. Democracy promotion, good governance, and market liberalization rose to the forefront. The new battle cry was not just against communism, but for free markets and democratic values. Like the Mongol Empire's embrace of trade along the Silk Road, USAID championed economic openness and integration. Aid became increasingly tied to political reforms, a conditionality that aimed to reshape not just economies, but political systems themselves. Into the 21st century, USAID's mandate continues to evolve. Global health crises, humanitarian emergencies, and the looming threat of climate change have become central challenges. The focus has broadened to encompass sustainable development, resilience, and localization, empowering local actors and communities. From combating pandemics to fostering climate resilience, USAID's modern mission is vast and multifaceted. It remains a powerful instrument of American foreign policy, but its role, its effectiveness, and its future are subjects of ongoing debate, scrutiny, and transformation. But empires, even those built on good intentions, are never without their fault lines. For USAID, the 21st century has brought a barrage of scrutiny, a questioning of its very foundations. The grand edifice of aid, once envisioned as an unstoppable force for progress, now faces a storm of challenges, internal and external. Imagine the Mongol Khans facing not just armies, but 1,000 voices of dissent, questioning the very legitimacy of their rule. This is the modern battleground for USAID. Not physical territories, but the contested terrain of public opinion and global politics. The first volley of criticism strikes at the heart of effectiveness. Does aid actually work? Decades of development efforts have yielded a mixed report card. Critics point to instances where aid seems to have fostered dependency, not development, where funds have been mismanaged or failed to reach those most in need. It's the modern equivalent of questioning whether the Mongol conquests truly brought prosperity or just plunder in disguise. The data itself is a battleground, with studies clashing and opinions fiercely divided. The question lingers: is the vast machinery of USAID truly delivering on its promises, or is it an engine running in place? Then comes the thorny issue of tied aid. Like empires of old demanding tribute, donor nations, including the US, often link aid to their own interests. Tied aid, requiring recipient countries to purchase goods and services from the donor, has long been a contentious practice. Critics argue it inflates costs, undermines local industries, and distorts development priorities. Imagine if the Silk Road only flowed in one direction, enriching only the Mongol center. Tied aid raises questions about whose interests are truly being served, the recipients or the donors themselves. The debate over localization, shifting power and resources to local organizations, is a direct response to this critique, a push to untie the strings and reshape the flow of aid. The specter of geopolitics looms large. USAID, as an arm of the US government, is inevitably entangled in the currents of American foreign policy. Critics argue that aid is often used as a tool of strategic influence, направлений towards furthering US interests, sometimes at the expense of genuine development needs. Think of the Mongol Empire strategically placing its relay posts to control trade routes and communication. Is USAID's aid similarly strategically placed, направлений towards securing alliances and advancing American power? The line between humanitarianism and geopolitics is often blurred, fueling accusations of conditionality and hidden agendas. Internally, USAID grapples with its own Leviathan structure. Bureaucracy, inefficiency, and slow processes are perennial challenges for large organizations, and USAID is no exception. Imagine the vast Mongol administration, stretching across continents, inevitably facing delays and bottlenecks. Critics point to layers of bureaucracy, complex procedures, and slow disbursement of funds, hindering the speed and effectiveness of aid delivery. The call for reform, for streamlining operations and cutting red tape, echoes constantly within and outside the agency. The shadow of corruption and misuse of funds is an ever-present concern. In any large-scale endeavor involving vast sums of money, the risk of corruption is inherent. USAID, operating in complex and often fragile environments, is not immune. Imagine the Mongol Empire, despite its vastness, struggling to control corruption among its far-flung officials. Scandals and reports of aid diversion, while not always widespread, erode public trust and undermine the legitimacy of aid efforts. Demands for greater transparency, accountability, and robust oversight are crucial to safeguarding the integrity of USAID's mission. Empires are rarely judged solely by their own emperors. History's verdict is often shaped by the voices of observers, critics, and commentators, the pundits of their time. For USAID, a chorus of expert opinions exists, a spectrum of perspectives that both praise and challenge its vast undertaking. Imagine the Mongol Kurultai, the Great Council, where voices clashed and debated the direction of the empire. This section is our Kurultai for USAID, a gathering of expert voices weighing its merits and demerits. One voice, that of Pundit One Name, e.g., a development economist, argues that, quote, insert quote praising USAID's impact, e.g., USAID has been instrumental in driving significant progress in global health, particularly in combating diseases like HIV, AIDS and malaria, saving millions of lives. This perspective emphasizes the tangible achievements, the lives saved, the progress made in specific sectors. It's the view that sees the Silk Road flourishing, trade routes expanding, and prosperity spreading under Mongol rule. For proponents, USAID is a force for demonstrable good, a vital engine of positive change in a world desperately in need. But the counter-arguments are equally forceful. Another perspective, voiced by Pundit Two Name, e.g., a political scientist specializing in aid, contends that, quote, insert quote questioning aid effectiveness, e.g., despite decades of aid, many recipient countries remain trapped in cycles of poverty and dependency. USAID's approach often fails to address the root causes of underdevelopment, sometimes even exacerbating existing problems. This viewpoint raises uncomfortable questions about long-term impact, about unintended consequences, about whether aid is truly empowering or inadvertently creating new forms of reliance. It's the critique that sees the Mongol conquests leaving a trail of destruction, disrupting existing systems without building lasting foundations. A third voice, often from within the development community itself, calls for radical reform. Pundit Three Name, e.g., a leader in a localization movement, asserts, quote, insert quote advocating for localization, e.g., the future of effective aid lies in localization. We need to shift power and resources to local communities and organizations, empowering them to lead their own development journeys, rather than imposing top-down solutions. This perspective champions a fundamental shift in approach, urging a move away from top-down, donor-driven models towards locally led, participatory development. It's the call for a decentralized empire, empowering local leaders and regions, rather than centralizing power in the hands of the Khans. The geopolitical dimension cannot be ignored. Pundit Four Name, e.g., an expert in foreign policy, observes, quote, insert quote on geopolitics of aid, e.g., USAID, inevitably, operates within the framework of U.S. foreign policy. While humanitarian goals are stated, strategic interests often shape aid priorities and distribution. The challenge is to ensure that aid serves genuine development needs, and not just short-term geopolitical objectives. This voice reminds us of the inherent tension between humanitarianism and national interest, a tension that has always shaped empires and continues to shape the empire of aid. Just as the Mongol Empire expanded its reach for both power and trade, USAID navigates the complex terrain where compassion and strategy intertwine. These are just a few voices in a vast and ongoing debate. The pundits, the experts, the critics, they offer no easy answers, but a multitude of perspectives. Their words highlight the inherent complexities, the contradictions, and the enduring questions surrounding USAID's role in the world. Is it a force for progress, a tool of power, or something in between? The answer, it seems, is as multifaceted and contested as the empire of aid itself. What does the future hold for USAID? Like gazing into the swirling mists of time, predicting the trajectory of a global power is fraught with uncertainty. Yet, based on current trends and expert analysis, we can envision several plausible paths for this 21st century empire of aid. Imagine the Mongol Khans at a crossroads, contemplating different strategies for expansion and consolidation. USAID, too, stands at a juncture, with its future shaped by forces both within and beyond its control. Scenario 1. The localization surge. One possible future sees USAID embracing the localization agenda with unprecedented vigor. Imagine a shift in power, a decentralization of control, akin to the Mongol Empire's khanates evolving into distinct entities. In this scenario, USAID transforms from a top-down implementer to a facilitator, channeling resources and decision-making power directly to local communities and organizations in recipient countries. Aid becomes less about imposing external solutions and more about empowering local actors to drive their own development. This future prioritizes local ownership, context-specific solutions, and building sustainable, indigenous capacity. Scenario 2. Geopolitical realignment. As global power dynamics shift, USAID could become even more explicitly intertwined with U.S. geopolitical strategy. Imagine USAID as a modern-day Silk Road architect, strategically building alliances and countering rivals. In this scenario, aid priorities are increasingly shaped by geopolitical competition, particularly in regions contested by rising powers. USAID's programs become more overtly aligned with U.S. foreign policy objectives, used to strengthen partnerships, counter the influence of strategic competitors, and secure access and influence in key regions. Development aid becomes a tool in a larger game of global power projection. Scenario 3. The climate and crisis imperative. The escalating climate crisis and the increasing frequency of humanitarian disasters could force a fundamental shift in USAID's priorities. Imagine the Mongol Empire facing a sudden, continent-wide environmental catastrophe, demanding a complete reorientation of resources. In this scenario, USAID becomes primarily a crisis response agency, focused on climate change adaptation, disaster relief, and humanitarian aid. Long-term development goals take a backseat to immediate survival needs. Resources are overwhelmingly directed towards building resilience to climate shocks, addressing humanitarian emergencies, and mitigating the impacts of global crises. The empire of aid becomes an empire of resilience, focused on survival in a turbulent world. These scenarios are not mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive. The future of USAID is likely to be a complex interplay of these and other forces. Perhaps we will see elements of localization surge alongside geopolitical realignment, all while grappling with the ever-intensifying climate crisis. The empire of aid may fragment, adapt, or transform in ways we cannot yet fully foresee. But understanding these potential pathways is crucial to navigating the uncertain terrain ahead. Empires, whether of conquest or aid, leave indelible marks on the world. Each path USAID might take into the future carries profound economic and political consequences, both for recipient nations and for the United States itself. Imagine the Mongol Empire's decisions on trade routes and governance, each choice unleashing cascading effects across Eurasia. Similarly, the future direction of USAID will trigger significant economic and political ripples, reshaping global landscapes in complex ways. Scenario 1. Localization surge, economic and political impacts. Economically, a localization surge could unleash a wave of endogenous growth in recipient countries. Imagine local economies flourishing like trade centers along a revitalized Silk Road, driven by local innovation and entrepreneurship. By investing directly in local organizations and businesses, aid could catalyze job creation, build local industries, and foster more sustainable economic development from the ground up. Politically, localization could lead to stronger, more accountable local governance, empowered civil societies, and potentially, a reduction in aid dependency and corruption. However, risks exist. Localization may face challenges in contexts with weak governance, limited local capacity, or ongoing instability, potentially leading to uneven development or even setbacks. Scenario 2. Geopolitical realignment, economic and political impacts. A geopolitically driven USAID could see aid flows strategically directed to bolster alliances and counter rivals. Economically, this could translate to targeted investments in infrastructure, technology, or resource access in strategically vital regions, potentially benefiting both the U.S. and its partner countries. Imagine USAID as a strategic investor, securing trade routes and resources like the Mongol Khans secured their supply lines. Politically, this scenario could strengthen U.S. influence in key geopolitical theaters, forging deeper alliances and potentially shifting the balance of power. However, this approach risks further politicizing aid, potentially alienating non-aligned nations, and raising ethical concerns about using aid as a tool of leverage rather than a primary instrument for development. It could also lead to a perception of neocolonialism, undermining the legitimacy of aid efforts. Scenario 3. Climate and crisis imperative, economic and political impacts. A USAID primarily focused on climate and crisis response would face immense economic demands. Imagine the Mongol Empire diverting its resources to manage a widespread famine or plague. Economically, resources would be heavily directed towards humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and building climate resilience. While this could stimulate innovation in green technologies and create new sectors focused on climate adaptation, it may also divert resources from long-term development investments in other sectors. Politically, This scenario could foster greater global cooperation on climate change and humanitarian crises, potentially strengthening international institutions and norms. However, climate aid could also become a new arena for geopolitical competition, with nations vying for influence through climate assistance. Furthermore, the sheer scale of climate-related displacement and instability could strain political systems and exacerbate existing tensions. The economic and political ramifications of USAID's future are vast and interconnected. Each path presents both opportunities and risks, benefits and drawbacks. Like the Mongol Empire grappling with succession crises and internal divisions, USAID faces complex choices with far-reaching consequences. The Empire of Aid, in its future form, will not only shape the lives of millions across the globe but also redefine America's role in an increasingly complex and uncertain world. The choices made today will determine not just the fate of USAID, but the very nature of global development and international power dynamics for decades to come. The story of USAID, our modern empire of aid, is far from a simple tale of conquest or collapse. It's a continuing saga, a narrative still being written on the global stage. Like the legacy of the Mongol Empire, its impact is complex, multifaceted, and subject to ongoing interpretation. We've journeyed through its historical sweep, confronted its present challenges, heard the voices of its critics and champions, and glimpsed possible futures that lie ahead. What is clear is that in an interconnected world, the imperative for international cooperation remains as critical as ever. Whether facing global pandemics, climate change, or persistent inequalities, the need for nations to work together, to assist one another, endures. Like the Silk Road fostering exchange and connection across Eurasia, the ideal of international aid, at its heart, is about building bridges, not walls, about shared progress, not isolated prosperity. Quote, "The path forward for USAID, and for the broader endeavor of international aid, is not predetermined. It will be shaped by choices, by debates, by the evolving global landscape. Will it embrace radical localization, or become further entangled in geopolitics? Will it primarily focus on crisis response, or long-term transformative development? The answers to these questions will not only define the future of this empire of aid, but will also influence the very shape of the world we collectively build. The legacy of USAID, like all empires before it, will ultimately be judged not just by its power, but by its lasting impact on humanity. Enjoyed this deep dive into USAID? Support our channel by subscribing and clicking the good button. The images you saw were created with Imagine 3, and the voice you heard is thanks to VoiceGate. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.